Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about why you can't seem to ever feel, target, generate soreness in your rear delts. Because a lot of us had this issue, clients of mine had this issue, and despite doing a lot of the supposed rear delt exercises like reverse flies, rows, those kinds of things, a lot of us can't seem to really grow this region, make this region sore. So let's talk about why I think that's the case, and then based on that, what we can do to solve this issue. So this happens for two main reasons, but first I want to sort of orient ourselves here on the board. What I'm trying to represent here is a rib cage from top down. So imagine that someone is doing a reverse fly, let's say on a machine, the supposed quintessential rear delt exercise, and you hover above them and you're looking down at them, right? Okay, so from the top down, this is what we're looking at. The head is somewhere here. When we look at an individual who's doing a reverse fly, and I'll just draw this on here, here's maybe their scapula, right, their shoulder blade. Here's where their shoulder socket is. You know, they have their arm here, there's a handle here, and they're kind of going from here, and then their arm ends up somewhere out here, right? This is supposed to be like a rear delt thing, and it absolutely is. But one of the major issues, I think, and this is point number one here, that occurs in a lot of commonly described rear delt exercises is that the rear delt oftentimes doesn't undergo a ton of length change. So issue number one is really stretch and creating longer muscle lengths. Now, when we look at the rear delt specifically and the anatomy of the rear delt attaches from the scapula, which is why I've drawn it to begin with, and it runs from what's called the scapular spine kind of over here, and it loops around onto the upper arm like this. Okay, and what it does is it pulls the arm, boop, in that backward direction. You can do this from a variety of different places, but it's safe to say pulls the arm kind of out like that. And so when we're doing a reverse fly, that's happening, right? To some degree at least. But what isn't really happening in this kind of reverse fly is we're not really creating a ton of length change, specifically in what I think is probably the most important portion of the length change, meaning it's the region where the most amount of length change occurs throughout this entire range, which is sort of more where your arm moves in this direction across your body to some degree. In other words, it's the difference between stopping a motion right here and stopping a motion right here. It might seem like a very, very subtle change in position, but based on just the joint mechanics and specifically how this thing rotates and how this length changes relative to that rotation, this is where so much of a disproportionate amount of the length change occurs. And so we can generalize this to any exercise, which is to say that if you're training any muscle, you want the muscle to change length, right? We're not doing biceps curls and just holding the weight there. We're going through elbow curling and elbow extending to train the biceps. So in the same sense, if we're doing something two arms at the same time, yeah, if you feel great with that, if you rear delts get nice and sore, rear delts are growing, no problem. But if you're someone who, like me, for years and years and years, just struggled to ever feel my rear delts, to ever get them sore, to ever really grow them substantially, then this might be exactly what you need. And so when the arm comes farther across the body, not only do we get this greater length change, but just based on the muscle mechanics of the rear delts also are really the only tissue that can function to pull the arm outward like this in this particular position when our arms are in front of the body. So not only are you creating more length, but you're also moving through a specific range where other muscles have less and less and less of an ability to contribute. Okay, so that's reason number one, is muscle length, and specifically what this difference in position does and how that may actually really help us. Now, issue number two and potential solution number two is not just to change ourselves from going from here to here. Because, you know, if we, let's say we do a cable reverse fly and we do that whole thing where maybe instead of doing two arms, we do a single arm and we're stretching more across our body, a lot of times people will still not feel much rear delts and they'll still feel mostly traps. Well, why might that be? Well, this thing called resistance direction, which is fancy language, not that fancy language, for what is the load trying to do to you, right? So if we rewind just a second here and we say, okay, well, the rear delts are really mostly active in this sort of front portion of the range. In other words, where my arm is sort of in front of my body. And let's say I have a resistance direction with a cable that's kind of pulling me forward like a row or something like that. Well, that's no good because I'm not really loading this portion of the range. So what do we need a resistance to be doing to our bodies when we're going through this X range of motion? We need it to be actually loading that range of motion. So in other words, instead of having a cable pulling this way or something like that, we need a cable or something similar pulling that direction. Why? So that this segment, as it moves through space, as my arm travels in front of my body this way, my arm is actually being pulled across my body in the opposite direction so that I can use my rear delt to act against it. So if you just simply have the muscle length conversation down pat, great. But if you don't know how to actually load the tissue in the gym, it's irrelevant, right? So muscle length, muscle leverage is an important part of the conversation, but the other half of the conversation is how do we load this thing, okay? One more thing that I forgot to mention earlier on is with this whole reverse fly motion, right? So we talked about the quintessential rear delt reverse fly motion. Why do a lot of people seem to be feeling things like traps as opposed to rear delts? Well, part of that we discussed, which is that, again, this whole window of rear delt territory mostly versus other stuff that starts to contribute more when we're moving backward. In other words, as we move the arm backward, the traps, specifically the different portions of the traps, the middle traps, I would say primarily amongst them, start to have to handle more load because that load is acting against our scapula more directly. It's trying to pull our scapula forward now. But another problem is even if you set up a reverse fly perfectly for your mechanics, a lot of machine reverse flies are most challenging in this position, meaning when your arm is backward over here. And it's not that your rear delt doesn't contribute to that motion, it's just that, as I mentioned, the amount of resistance that your traps have to deal with is proportionately so much greater in that position, and the amount of strength that your rear delt has because of how short it is and because of how low leverage it has in that position is very disproportionate compared to this one. So if I had to sort of make a generalized claim here, this is a ton of rear delt, almost exclusively rear delt. Obviously, your traps need to hold your scapula to your body and everything like that. But the more that you move this way, the more trap dominant this will become, right? And somewhere in the middle, you know, somewhere over here, kind of going to be a blend, right? So on this side of the spectrum, oh, rear delt, trap, 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 right? And again, it's not that the rear delt all of a sudden just falls off your body and turns off. But the involvement here, I'm trying to just paint a clear picture of how disproportionate the contribution is. And so a lot of times those machine reverse flies, they're only really challenging, really heavy, just from a torque perspective, from a resistance perspective, when our arms are all the way behind our bodies. And so we need to try to use implements that are really heavy over here, i.e. like setting a cable reverse fly up, where the cable, again, as I mentioned earlier, is not just pulling us forward to some degree, it's pulling us across to a large degree. So I'll obviously put in a lot of videos over top of me talking here so that you can see visuals of what these things should look like. But this is something that has totally changed the game for me. Now, again, if you're someone who you do rows, you do pull downs, you do reverse flies at any angle, and for whatever reason, it's like you're good on the rear delt stuff, for whatever reason that might be, maybe it's your particular anatomy, the way that you're setting these things up, no problem. You don't have to worry about this at all. Boxes are checked for you. Perhaps you have other issues that people with rear delt issues don't have. Right? So a lot of people, they can't really feel their lats particularly well. That's never been a problem for me. But historically, at least years ago at this point, I never really was able to feel my rear delts and train them and make them sore. But now, having applied these principles, I can absolutely do that in any gym and really any setting. So I hope this was helpful. If there needs to be some sort of point of clarification here that I haven't made totally clear, please feel free to ask a question, drop a comment. And if you like this video, share it with a friend. I love when people share the videos. It's really helpful to the channel, and it's really helpful just to sort of get more people who are interested in these topics watching these kinds of videos.